In this video, we will continue covering chapter 8.5 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. More precisely, we will show how to use query annotation to create JPQL that is using interface-based closed projection when there is a one-to-one relationship with a parent and a child. So by using a closed-based interface projection, we can specify to retrieve only subset of parent properties as defined by person projection. So this is a person projection where we define that we are only interested in name and age properties of the person entity, and person entity has these properties: ID, name, age, and height, and we are only interested in the name and age. And since we also will be using address projection, where we only are interested in following two properties, our person projection then needs to also have a getter for getting the address projection. And address projection has city, state, ID, state, city, and street, and our projection will only have city and street. Although by using person projection, we can specify the subset of parent properties which will be retrieved from the database, but unfortunately all child properties will be retrieved from the database regardless of how we define our address projection. So even though our address projection will only have city and address, when we later take a look at the SQL statement that will be generated, we will see that from the address all the properties are being retrieved: ID, city, state, and street, and not just city and the state and the street as defined by address projection. So this is how our application will look like. We will have two entities, person and address. Person entity will have following properties, and we will also define a custom constructor which will allow us to more easily create person instances when we have to load test data into the database. So this loading is done with this class, load persons, where we are loading person entities into the database by using this custom constructor. And we will also use the custom constructor which allow us to create address instances for the same purpose. So this is our address entity with following properties, and for this address entity we have also defined the custom constructor so that we can more easily insert address data, create instances of address data when inserting them here in this load persons object, and this class will run and execute the run statement when the application starts, so that we have our test records in the database. Our application properties file will have properties that configure H2 database and then properties that configure Hibernate. So for each entity, we will create a projection that only contains a subset of those entities' properties. So person projection will contain, with these getters, defines that we are only interested in name and age, and that we are not interested in retrieving ID or height from the database. And with address projection, we say that we are only interested in city and street. So only this will be populated in this address projection, but unfortunately from the database all the properties will be retrieved, so the child projection cannot be used to reduce the load to the database by retrieving only subset of entity properties. We will have also person repository which will be used to store person entities into the database, and by storing person entities, address entities which are related to person entities with one-to-one relationship will be automatically also stored. So in this load persons, in our person repository, we will create an additional repository method which will execute this JPQL query, which retrieves from person only properties we are interested in, plus the related address entity. So if we take a closer look at our person entity, we see that it has this property address, which is annotated with one-to-one relationship, which makes then this relationship between person and other address entity. And in our JPQL query, we have to say that we want address to be fetched, otherwise it will not be fetched. And here is our controller, which calls this repository method. And since this repository method actually returns person projection, this is what our endpoint is expecting to get when the method is called. And once it gets this person projection, it can use getAddress getter to get the address projection, and this address projection will then be returned from the endpoint and displayed in the web browser as a JSON string. So here we are calling the getter that was defined in the address projection into a person projection here in order to get the instance of this address projection interface. We can now test our application by using Google Chrome web browser and entering URL of our endpoint, which will return the address in the form of a JSON string. If we take a look at the console, we can see that from the person entity, only name and age properties were retrieved as defined by person projection, so only properties of interest were actually retrieved from the database, but all the properties from the city were retrieved from the database, even though in our projection we will only get city and the street. So in this tutorial we have seen how to use query methods and JPQL to only retrieve parent properties of interest and also to automatically retrieve an address entity, where this address entity will be also projected into its address projection, and this projection will then only have properties defined with its getter values, so that we can work only with properties that interest us and not with all the properties that are part of the either address entity or person entity.